Israel asked me to preach. Well, actually, I gotta do this story right. Let's do this story justice, so that she can feel the requisite amount of guilt, because I never get to do this to her. Joanna and I are on the leadership team, of course, and if you have been here for more than 2 weeks, you will know that if Joanna is not in the room and there's a request, I probably am gonna volunteer for it. And it's not that her being gone makes me more likely to. It's that her being gone means I don't get to look at her and confirm beforehand. I still volunteer for things when she's in the room. It's just usually it's just a little bit more funny when I do it when she's not here. So with that preface in mind, 2 weeks ago, I was taking care of our kids while the leadership call was going on. And so I was not actually present in the call. And Joanna hears Israel say, I need somebody to preach in 2 weeks. And so what does she do? She volunteers me when I was not in the room. So turnabout is fair play. And, you know, I deserve it for multiple Friendsgivings and other things. But that's just who I am. I don't mind jumping in and presenting. I have done something a little different for this sermon. I've actually prepared. Normally, I write a few short bullet points, and I kind of have an idea in mind, and then I get up and I start talking about a bullet point, and by the time I get to the next bullet point, I have expanded on enough that nobody notices or knows that I didn't prepare more than 3 to 5 talking points. But when I found out I was preaching, I paused and I took a moment and I looked at the lectionary and I looked at what was going on in the world, and I said, I have something on my heart and I want to do that topic justice. And the only way to do that is to actually prepare. So, I am going to speak from the lectionary. I'm going to read those in a moment when we get to the relevant portion of the text. And I'm going to put all of my Church of Christ upbringing on display as I do Bible reading. So follow along. This is going to be a meandering. This is a little bit of a weave through a few different topics, but it's all going to wrap together well. 120 years ago this week, February 4th, 1906, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was born. For those of you who don't know him, he was a German theologian. He was a pretty ardent pacifist. But towards the end of his life, due to circumstances that he found himself in, he felt called to participate in potential violence as he sought to overthrow the Nazi government. And I say overthrow, he helped to plot assassination. And he actively resisted so many different facets of the Nazi government. And he really got popular, oddly enough, in mainstream American church in about 2011. There was a book that came out about him called Pastor Spy. It was a biography of Bonhoeffer. And I learned about Bonhoeffer from my dad, actually. That book was on his reading list. I got that book for him for Christmas in 2011. And then we had numerous discussions about Bonhoeffer after that fact. My dad my parents raised me to always look at evidence, to always weigh evidence in everything, to look at all the evidence, even in small things, because learning how to do that for small things helps you to do that for big things. And for the amount of distance I have with my parents now, there are some things that will always be ingrained in me. And that kind of logical approach of looking at the evidence, weighing all the evidence, is something that I will always have in me. I grew up in church talking about the evidence for Jesus. It was never a blind faith. It was, here's the evidence, and sure, we have some evidence that goes against our point of view. But if you look at the evidence and weigh both sides, this one wins. That was how those conversations happened for me. And I firmly believe that. And it's striking to me that my parents have lost that ability. My parents voted for the current administration, I'm almost certain. I have not confirmed, but I know they did the last time around. And knowing their beliefs on numerous topics, I'm pretty sure. And part of that is the distance I have with them, both physically and emotionally. They have lost that ability to weigh the evidence. And I'm going to call that, I'm going to coin a couple phrases here for you. There's something I want to call cheap logic and something I want to call costly logic. And those of you who are familiar with Bonhoeffer's works are going to smile. And I'm going to talk about his terms in a moment. But cheap logic is finding evidence that supports your theory and running with it. Cheap logic is surface level. It's, well, I'm not political. I don't know enough I don't know what's going on. Intentionally distancing yourself from things that are hard, that is cheap logic. Costly logic requires us to be willing to admit we are wrong. I will admit when I'm wrong. I absolutely will admit when I'm wrong. And there are times where I'm wrong every day. I make mistakes in parenting often, and I'm not looking for anyone to say, hey, you're a good parent. I know that I do a pretty bang-up job. I've got wonderful kids, but I know I make mistakes. We all make mistakes. Owning those mistakes is part of life we are called to. It's part of that costly logic. Being willing to look at ways you can improve, being willing to grow is part of that costly logic. I was raised without those phrases, but I was raised with the idea of costly logic. The church that I grew up in, although it is not this way now, firmly stood by at one time the idea that if definitive proof, irrefutable proof came out that God did not exist, that Jesus was not real, that they would walk away and be done. If definitive proof comes along of something, it's hard to argue with. Now, definitive proof of things is pretty rare. Unless we are in the movie Don't Look Up, you can look in the sky and we're pretty sure nothing's going to happen. Nothing's going to fall from the sky. But you know what? That doesn't mean it's not. It just means that we don't see any proof of it today. That idea of costly logic, I think, is something that we as a community need to own, something that we need to champion. Because relationships matter. And the way to maintain relationships, even when you have differing beliefs, is to be willing to admit when you're wrong. Whether that is in your intimate relationships, whether that is in your family relationships, whether that is with your friendships, being able to admit when you're wrong matters. And being able to admit when you're wrong makes proving you right more important also. When you're willing to be wrong, when you're willing to say, hey, I was wrong, and you come along and say, this is something that I stand behind, this is something I firmly believe, here's my evidence, people will notice, people will care, because they know that you're willing to be wrong. You're willing to look at the evidence. We've talked a lot recently about the need to be willing to care for people, even if we don't agree with them, even if we don't believe the same as them. We can't other them just because they have othered us. Jesus calls us to that. Bonhoeffer called us to that. He talked about this idea of, and I stole cheap logic and costly logic from this. He spoke about this idea of cheap grace versus costly grace. Cheap grace is, like I said, I prepared. Cheap grace is grace without discipleship, without the cross, without Jesus' living and incarnate faith. Cheap grace is offered freely without repentance, absolution without personal accountability. It reduces the gospel to simple doctrine, allowing people to claim forgiveness while continuing in sin, treating God's mercy as a given. Costly grace calls us to follow Jesus. It costs a man his life, yet it is grace because it gives the only true life. It condemns sin and justifies the sinner, and above all, it costs God the life of his son, Jesus, yet is free to us. Bonhoeffer lived in difficult times, and we also live in difficult times. There are a lot of people comparing those two times, and I think they are right to do so. I also think that in some ways we are much worse off, and in some ways we are much better off than Bonhoeffer was. And so we can't fall into the trap of just saying, oh, this is exactly like. It's not. There are differences, and those differences matter. The evidence matters. But this is where I get to pivot to the lectionary. Isaiah 58 is the Old Testament reading for today. So, shout out, do not hold back. Lift up your voice like a trumpet. Announce to my people their rebellion, to the house of Jacob their sins. Yet day after day they seek me and delight to know my ways, as if they were a nation that practiced righteousness and did not forsake the ordinance of their God. They ask of me righteous judgments. They delight to draw near to God. Why do we fast, but you do not see? Why humble ourselves, but you do not notice? Look, you serve your own interest on your fast day and oppress all your workers. Look, you fast only to quarrel and to fight and to strike with a wicked fist. Such fasting as you do today will not make your voice heard on high. Is such the fast that I choose, a day to humble oneself? Is it to bow down the head like a bulrush and to lie in sackcloth and ashes? Will you call this a fast, a day acceptable to the Lord? Is not this the fast that I choose? To loose the bonds of injustice, to undo the thongs of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry, and to bring the homeless poor into your house? When you see the naked, to cover them, and not to hide yourself from your own kin. Then your light shall break forth like the dawn, and your healing shall spring up quickly. Your vindicator shall go before you. The glory of the Lord shall be your rear guard. Then you shall call, and the Lord will answer. You shall cry for help, and he will say, Here I am. If you remove the yoke from among you, the pointing of the finger, the speaking of evil, if you offer your food to the hungry, and satisfy the needs of the afflicted, then your light shall rise in the darkness, and your gloom be like the noonday. The Lord will guide you continually, and satisfy your needs in parched places, and make your bones strong. And you shall be like a watered garden, like a spring of water, whose waters never fail. Your ancient ruins shall be rebuilt. You shall raise up the foundations of many generations. You shall be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of streets to live in. Isaiah presents a surprise. He presents to the people of God that while they may be following the letter of the fasts, they have completely missed out on the Spirit. They may be following the letter of the law, but they have missed out on what God actually cares about. I have seen multiple accounts in the past week or two about the Christian rationale for the ICE raids, for what is going on in our country. Oh, we're called as Christians to follow the law of our country. As Christians, it is not our place to dictate what the government does. As Christians, we need to respect our elected leaders. I've seen people that I respected say those things. And it hurts. Because it tells me that they have chosen cheap logic and cheap grace. Now, that is not to say that I'm perfect. I, myself, have chosen cheap grace and cheap logic at times. It's a whole lot easier. But silence is not neutrality. And we can't be silent about the injustices done among us. But we also cannot vilify those on the other side. I love my parents. I love my parents dearly. And I won't cut off contact with them. I have a brother that I know without a doubt supported the administration going into the start of the administration. And he and I are worlds apart in terms of some topics, and to the point where I will not bring up those topics because I know it is just asking for a fight. He doesn't even look at the evidence I see and think of it as evidence. That is how far apart we are. And a few years ago, my dad, in his loving, infinite wisdom, asked that I not cut my brother off. And I said, Dad, I'm not cutting Robert off. I just refuse to build a bridge when he refuses to start on his side. If I see him put effort in, I will absolutely match that. I will absolutely repair. But if he does not put in effort, then my effort is wasted. I'm not asking that we go make nice. But when we see people struggling, however they are struggling, whether it be because, man, they were gun rights activists, or man, they really firmly believed in, releasing files and getting people accountable for that sort of thing, and now they're questioning, I feel called. I feel called to exercise my costly logic and my costly grace, and to meet them where they are and work with them. And I hope you all will do the same. 120 years ago, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was born. 15 years ago, I got introduced to him through my father. And I find it ironic now that the man who introduced me to Bonhoeffer is someone who Bonhoeffer would look at and disagree with. And it makes me sad. But all I can do is be ready to meet him where he is and be ready to love him where he is. That's what I'm called to do. That's what we are all called to do. I think the question that remains is this. Both Isaiah and Bonhoeffer lead us to this question. Are we practicing a faith that costs us nothing, or a faith that follows Jesus? The fast that God chooses is not only what we give up, but who we stand with, who we defend, and how we love. May we be a community whose worship is recognized for those values, and whose faith is strong enough to change the outside world. Thank you.